All of us would like to have some magic quantifiable number that consistently be used. But I think once you get to social aspects, they are very contextualized. So it's just being very clear up front to say, like with TapEffect, at what cost can we add more people to a clean water pipe water system? Part of recovery was work. It wasn't just income. It was the dignity that comes from work, to meet expectations, to wear your uniform, have the right hygiene and appearance, to be part of the team. It was the dignity that comes from being part of a community. Money is a way to measure accountability. How much water are these people buying? Is your model based on a good revenue forecast? If they don't pay, will you cut the water off? That world still has to exist. Charity might have to come from a neighbor who shares their water. Water needs an impact approach. Water is not like a tech investment that's going to give you an amazing multiple, but it makes sense.
Over 83% of you that listen to or watch this show regularly haven't yet subscribed to this show. So could I ask you for a favor before we start today? If you like the show and if you like what we do here and you want to support us, the free and simple way that you can do just that is by hitting the subscribe button or following us on your podcast app. It helps this channel more than you know. Thank you and enjoy this episode. Talmage, it's really nice to meet you. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Scott.
Before we start getting into blended capital and everything that you've built in Cambodia, I'd like to start at the beginning. You were born in Nigeria. You grew up there where your parents were working as doctors. What was your childhood like growing up in that environment, and how did that shape you?
I was born in northern Nigeria. Kano, my parents were involved in building a hospital there. My mother was a nurse. My father was a ophthalmologist. I had this hospital like outside my bedroom window. So everything about that early childhood life was around this medical practice. I was born during the Biafran War, horrible experience, much like the Civil War in the United States. So there's a lot of times you say, well, I was born in northern Nigeria. People will say, ooh, I actually had a wonderful childhood. My mother was the sort of the nurse to the staff and the expatriate community. She had this big cabinet in her house full of meds that she would be taking care of people. And I think in their own way, at that time, they were entrepreneurs. I particularly see that in my father. So he was, in addition to studying tropical issues that affected eyes, how do you make medicine work in this difficult, resource poor, fragile context? How do you do an operation for about 1 month's salary or less? So you're bringing in that financial thinking. And what came of it was doing surgery almost like an assembly line, borrowing from practices in the Soviet Union, some in South Asia. Patients would be prepped here, moved to just like an assembly line, or any sort of treatment that required long-term drugs or medications, say glaucoma. When you had 800 to 1,000 patients coming every day, many of them who had traveled many, many days, it wasn't like you were going to be able to supply them with the drugs, or they would be able to come back at some point, and the drugs would be too expensive. So was there a surgical solution that allowed the treatment to happen, and then the patient could go home?
Where was this? What city did you grow up in?
In Kano. Kano is close to the border of Niger. When you're hearing bad news right now about Nigeria, it tends to be that area.
What size of a city were you in?
At this time, probably a couple million. At that time, probably 500,000.
And the hospital you said was outside your bedroom window. How big was that?
It was about 2 city blocks. And that hospital also included a blind school, accommodations for staff and things like that. My house was made of, we had a 3-bedroom house. It was made of mud, big, thick mud walls. Everyone that was involved with the hospital was on those 2 city blocks. We had the stadium nearby and things like that. But for me, it was a fun childhood.
And your parents, what nationalities were they?
The U.S.
So they went out there for this hospital.
I actually come from a line of impact people. My grandfather, he and his partner worked in what is now Yunnan province of China. They got married there, and were part of figuring out where does the Salween River go. After World War I, there was a large movement from the West to set up universities, hospitals, and other things in China. My grandparents were part of that. And my father then was born in a place called Manga, which is about 150 kilometers in from the Myanmar border.
But then your parents were in America. Your mother's also American as well?
My mother's American as well.
And did they meet in America or did they meet abroad as well?
So my grandfather, Talmage, returned to the United States as World War II was starting, and he moved to Georgia area and became involved with the civil rights movement. My grandfather, Talmage, was working on education for African Americans. And the innovation of the time was correspondence classes. So he would get a university in the North to provide a correspondence class in the South. There's still a Carver College in the Atlanta area that's a product of that work. Part of the original goal was to have more African Americans and qualified as teachers and things for education. That was my father's upbringing in that context. My father and my mother met in Augusta, Georgia, Medical College of Georgia. So when he finished his ophthalmology, they were off to Nigeria.
Fast forward through your childhood, and around 1986, you went off to study economic development and environmental studies at Wheaton College, which is in Wheaton, Illinois, not the one in Massachusetts, which I happen to know personally as my older sister went there as an undergraduate, and that I went several years to their basketball camp in the summers, as have my two sons. Now, obviously, it's been a while since I've been on a basketball court, but I know a bit about that college, and I know enough about it to know that you attending there, coming from Nigeria, had to be a very deliberate choice. What drew you to Wheaton and to the economic development and environmental studies?
So I actually made a move to the U.S., I think, the middle of my junior year in high school. And I ended up in Wheaton because my father's sister lived in Wheaton. It was quite an adjustment. I remember it was incredibly cold. And then you just have these cultural adjustments where people think you have a favorite football team and you don't. Or I remember the first time going to a movie theater, and it was The Witness by Harrison Ford. A man was concerned with the R rating because there was nudity, and I was offended by the amount of violence that took place in an Amish community. Different cultural experiences. I did apply to a number of schools, but Wheaton was close by, and I had friends going there. I started off not really sure what I was going to do with it, which is kind of an expensive thing to do, so then I took a gap year. Why am I getting this education? Where am I taking it? All of my father's siblings were in medicine. Should I do medicine or not? One of the things that my Uncle Paul said, if you don't want to be with sick people, don't be a doctor. You're going to spend your time with people who are unhappy. I went to work at a ranch in Colorado, saved some money, and then traveled the cheapest ticket. I ended up in Paris, and then I went around through Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Cyprus, and back out. I came back very interested in some of the bigger complex issues in the world. I remember being at the Aswan Dam, and it ended up being funded by the Soviet Union and had a huge impact on Egypt. But it was this complex web of Cold War politics and UNESCO World Heritage Site, and these sort of big picture things. And so studying economic development and things was a way to be as interdisciplinary as I could. And Wheaton was also a place, as a person of faith, kind of struggling with the environment that I was experiencing in the U.S. This was the time of moral majority, other things like that, where I had specific professors that helped Norm Ewart in economics that wanted to bring values to environment and things like that. So I started combining philosophy, Asian philosophy, studying world religions, economics, with an interest in environment, and that became my degree.
You graduated early 90s and you didn't stick around in the comfortable margins. You went straight into the thick of it and moved to Cambodia, which must have been at the time in the violent aftermath of the Khmer Rouge conflict. So tell me, what was the decision making process going on in your head at that time that led to that move?
My father and my grandfather were people that showed up in hard places to figure out how to have an impact. And in a sense, my morning reflections would be reading the New York Times, reading the Psalms, and trying to figure out what does all this mean. And places that seemed dark to me were places where there was violence. And that was beyond poverty. Violence was a formative experience for me. My childhood was in this safe space that the hospital created, but a very fragile environment all around it. There was a time during the Biafran War where there was ethnic cleansing at the hospital. And then coming back to a safe environment, which is Wheaton, the first Gulf War breaks out, and people were watching the war like it was a football game. It's like we were cheering while people were dying. I buried myself in, how does this violence hold together? How do you make a difference in the world? I basically had a few countries in the world that I was aiming at. Could I get to Cambodia? Could I get to Afghanistan, North Korea, and the Balkans somehow? I found that opportunity through an organization that I had a great deal of respect for, World Vision, because it had courage in hard places. And to give you an example of what it meant, so Cambodia, I arrived before the UN came in, the transitional government. So we have the U.S.-Vietnamese conflict. The U.S. withdraws. Khmer Rouge is in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge invades Vietnam. Vietnam then invades Cambodia. It ends up with its own occupation problem, like the U.S. had. Lots of casualties and things like that. And then the refugees moved into Thailand. Being a humanitarian worker in Cambodia would be the equivalent today of being a humanitarian worker in the Soviet Union with the conflict with Ukraine. So it was just about as contrarian as I could possibly put my skills and faith at the time, with real humanitarian needs. It was 4 or 5 years of doing anything possible to keep people alive and moving.
In total, you were there about 15 years. I guess when you started, you went in as a humanitarian response manager, but ultimately you were the national director for Cambodia. So take me on that journey step by step and tell me what those years taught you.
The early years was something out of, I tell people, watch Beyond Borders, Angelina Jolie movie, trucks, food aid. UN comes in, the context becomes a bit more stable. Through 1997, there are various coups that end up with a more stable government. The aid community switches from disaster mode to relief mode. I took on roles in Cambodia. For a period, a couple of years, I took on other regional humanitarian work. The conflict in Sri Lanka, but Cambodia was my base. I ended up as head of operations for World Vision in Cambodia. And then I ended up as country leader, late 90s, early 2000s. At this point, the country was largely stable. Most of our programming was switching to agriculture, health. HIV was a big issue at the time.
What kind of programs were you actually involved with? What was the scale of the organization there?
When I was country leader, we were handling about 25 million dollars a year. That was about the size of the program. 400 or 500 staff across a number of provinces, trying to improve public health outcomes, trying to improve livelihood outcomes, education outcomes.
You started with them originally around 2003. You were still there, but then you founded something called Vision Fund Cambodia. Walk me through that. What was Vision Fund Cambodia? What was your thinking?
This guy is really the start of my impact journey. In our development projects, we were using community savings and loan in different parts of the country. I had been reading about Grameen Bank and other things. There were other people in World Vision interested in this issue. What I had in this program was very different performance from staff. This area had high repayment rates. This area had low repayment rates. And I thought what we needed to do was to bring the magic of the investment model to bring a great deal of focus around the long-term value of money in sort of solving a problem. In order to do that, this had to be separated from the NGO itself so that the money was recycling back into its purposes and you could create that credit discipline and savings discipline. And you could also make sure that it was targeting the right people. So microfinance was becoming popular. And like many things in development, it can get overcooked and then there's a backlash. So you don't do microfinance. I would call it financial services for the poor because it should be insurance, savings, not just lending. You start at what I would call the resource poor. There's a certain point below that where you're helping them build assets. You might do direct fund transfers, but you don't get into lending. And then there's a point where people have social capital, good community structures and things like that, but they don't have resources. And that's where that microfinance piece came in.
So Vision Fund was a microfinance company?
Vision Fund is a microfinance company. We took the financial service components of our NGO projects and we put it into one institution and started working through licensing there. And then at the international level, World Vision was under a man named Chris Shore was beginning to look at all of this around the world. And World Vision now has a Vision Fund International in some 40 or different countries. The Cambodia operation was the precursor to looking at financial services for the poor.
And World Vision International, that's pure NGO. That's just doing projects with grant money or donated money. Who funds World Vision?
Well, I haven't been part of World Vision for some time, but yes, it has a lot of grants. And it has child sponsorship, and it has a strong network around the world. So you'd have World Vision Korea, Japan, and other countries that were all feeding into the Cambodia program, not just out of the U.S. It was focused on the well-being of children. Those are some of the core components.
While you were there, you saw an opportunity to actually do microfinance lending. And for what type of projects?
So it was mostly rural farm-based, other types of credit. I was also interested in savings, finding a place for people to save besides obviously having more livestock and other things or tucking a piece of gold under your mattress, being able to create a place where they could save money. And that was a big component of it. It needed to be separate from the NGO in order to bring those market disciplines to it in terms of who the customer is and increasingly regulated. And then we did take a touch on insurance. You know, HIV, AIDS was a significant issue. The full treatments that we have today were not fully understood. That was a risk to lending. It was a social health problem, but it's also just a math problem. You know, what percentage of your portfolio is at risk? What would it cost to insure that percentage so that if that does happen, you're not collecting the loan from them? And then you have to build that into the cost of your operations. And then you can tell your staff, we're not screening for this sort of thing.
This was something different than just doing basic donor work. So what did you learn about designing social ventures for sustainability or self-sustainability rather than perpetual dependence on donors?
Whether it's venture philanthropy, whether you're donating money into a venture or impact investing, you now have to take a problem and think about the long-term value of money and money being a way just to measure sustainability. How are you going to sustain that outcome? And in a nonprofit, you have these two very different stakeholders, and sometimes it's called the stakeholder gap. There's the people who give you money, and then there's the people that you're supporting. And you hold the two together with good management. You can get money this way by raising capital. You give money, and then you do something for them. When you do a social venture, you take those two stakeholders and you link them together in a real way.
What did you see, or what was the thinking at the time that you finally said, we got to get out of this constant donor thing and get self-sustaining? Let's try to figure that out.
It was a learned process, and this making capital available or growing savings was only going to work if it was separated from the nonprofit space. If this analogy is helpful, we always talk about don't give a fish, teach a person to fish. The NGO will, a nonprofit will teach people to fish, and they'll have maybe a good program or bad program, but you need one really good story, because it's stories that generate the income.
But it's not really income. The income is actually donor money.
It's donor money. So, yeah. But at some point, you've got to ask the question, who pays the teacher and where do you sell the fish? When you think about many of the problems that we need to face in the world, we've got to mobilize a lot more capital into the impact space because it's thinking about the problem of where the fish are being sold, where the teachers are going to come from. And it's got to say X amount of money goes in here. How do you keep sustaining that outcome?
How successful or unsuccessful was this World Vision Fund?
It was very successful. In 4 or 5 years, we had reached around $30 million assets under management. We were making money by the third year. Cambodia was a place that was ready for it. The hard part was trying to carve it out of the organization. I brought in people that knew what they were doing and had good people like Chris Shore and then later Scott Brown with a great deal more experience than I did that really helped to create the institution. So it did well. I think today they have about 800 million in assets that they are integrating.
Then around 2006, you left World Vision and became the global CEO of Hagar International, which I understand is an organization working with survivors of human trafficking. What led to that change for you? And for people who don't know Hagar, give the 30,000 foot view of what it does and what's the gap that the organization is trying to fill.
There was parts of the outside world that were changing a lot. The internet was now creating real value. Another thing that was happening, I met my spouse earlier during the times of conflict in Cambodia. I wasn't going to leave the country. So I got to find something in Cambodia. I actually did 3 things coming out. One was First Finance, one was Hagar. The other was what we call the CEO Institute in Cambodia. But Hagar was started by the Tammy family, Swiss-Italian family. They were very good at working with women and children that suffered from extreme abuse. What I felt was needed in that sector was a very specialized approach. And I said, what would be a very boutique approach that was highly focused on a particular challenge or problem? My role was to be the builder. We took a local entity and created an international entity, set up boards in New Zealand and Australia and US to fund it, set up an international entity based out of Switzerland, and got some good long-term thought research. We had these long-term randomized control trials around trauma with Johns Hopkins and things like that. We really started digging into what is the journey of recovery for people who have had deep and systemic abuse. We opened in Afghanistan and Vietnam and a few other places.
While you were there, you developed something you call an integrated nonprofit / for-profit model. Maybe you also called it blended finance blueprint. Explain what that means in practice and why generating commercial revenue became essential to the mission.
Pierre Tammy, who had gotten Hagar started, did not have a development education like I did. And so he was very good at taking it down. He had this ability, like, we have to pursue what works for these kids. And if that means appealing to Caesar, we're all going to put a suit and tie on, we're going to go see Caesar. If that means we have to bend the business world, we'll bend the business world. I am not an original thinker. I am really good at figuring out the solution and making it happen. And there was almost no economy in Cambodia at this time compared to now. But how do we employ people from these particular backgrounds that were hard? We built a food service catering business. We had a soy milk business. The soy milk went unpopular, ended up being a brewery. We worked on making bags, different things. So you had a nonprofit side, which was the lawyers and psychologists and things like that. You know, you have a long court battle over seeking justice. But the nonprofit side, in this case, the goal was to employ what I call unemployable people.
These are people like who've been marginalized by trauma or disease.
Yes, human trafficking, other types of abuse. So let's take a Hagar catering business. Part of recovery was work. It wasn't just income. It was the dignity that comes from work. It was the dignity that comes from being part of a community, to meet expectations, to wear your uniform, have the right hygiene and appearance, to be part of a team. And you needed management that was trauma informed. The management would be measured, for example, positive turnover. So positive turnover is the number of employees that get promoted up or even out of the organization to better jobs. The point of the business was not to sustain the NGO. We had to find the right mix. There were also persons with disabilities. You can't have the entire employee base like this. You'd have to limit it. High would be 30%.
I didn't think about that, but yeah, you can't have 100%. Huh?
This is an example of where the investment goes in. It's not going to have a great return financially, but it's going to sustain this journey in which a person learns to engage in a normal work environment, learns to show up, learns to part of recreating their own dignity and develop a job skill and things that matter.
So you had these different businesses, and specifically your mission was to try to employ a certain percentage of unemployable people who had been traumatized by human trafficking. In 2009, you wrote some quite candid pieces about the internal conflicts you were seeing in these social enterprises, the tension between the social mission and the need for profitability. What were the biggest points of friction that you saw, and why did the traditional NGO culture sometimes work against the commercial discipline?
I should teach a class on this one. They do require separate cultures. The counselor, the lawyer, needs to stick with the case regardless of their work performance. We were winning the contract to provide the U.S. Embassy with its food service. You had to deliver. And we switched from restaurants to catering for schools, hospitals. So there was that tension. And so there was the people that give money that would say, well, why don't the businesses pay for the nonprofit side? If your goal, Scott, is to fund your nonprofit, then take a percentage of your income, give it to a professional fund manager who knows how to make money, and call it an endowment. That's the way to do it. But if there are some problems, like my work now in water and things like that, you will not solve it until you bring a market discipline to it. It's the only way to do it. There's a tension with your nonprofit side that said, you fired that person. So, well, there was a good reason to fire that person. The nonprofit side can't drop the case. They got to keep working the case. The cultures are very difficult. And many NGOs have gotten into it just as they think, if I could have a business, then I wouldn't have to raise as much money for the NGO. It's not the point.
Hagar was founded based on some deep faith-based convictions. How would you explain the tension between, let's call it faith-driven risk, and the hard-nosed financial discipline of financial planning and independent boards and professionalization and social enterprise? When push comes to shove, does one of those have to lose?
Let me try to unpack it in a couple ways. I mean, I'm a Christian. So where it goes wrong in my faith community, Christian community, is when the spiritual becomes prioritized over the temporal, when there's this hierarchy at place. And I definitely saw that in the organization my father was working with. He was doing fantastic medicine, but for some of the leaders, it was just, you do this so that the church can have a good reputation in this community, kind of thing. We've got these two wallets. We have an investment wallet and we have a philanthropic wallet. And so the Christian goes out there and with the investment wallet says, yeah, I need financial discipline because I need a good 401k because I need a retirement. And then the philanthropic wallet, it goes, well, God told me to, Jesus says, help the poor. So I toss it to the best story out there. So my expression of worship isn't a song I sing in church. My expression of worship is this integration of my spiritual world and my profession. There's a role for business, there's a role for nonprofits, there's a role for civil society, there's a role for government. And somehow in the middle, we have to create shared value.
Your idea was to have these businesses to employ people who are essentially unemployable. But eventually, Hagar divested from its wholly owned enterprises and moved to a partnership model. What was it about NGO ownership that was fundamentally unsustainable?
When you have a more middle income or higher income country and you are trying to employ not normally employable people, it's better to partner with a business that, for example, if you're working with a group of persons with disabilities, help them integrate into an established business. That's the better way to do it. When you have an economy that doesn't create any jobs, the Hagar approach makes sense.
You started at Hagar around 2006, but in 2008, in parallel to Hagar, you founded and launched First Finance PLC, which was Cambodia's first micro housing finance lender. And you apparently launched it just as the world was melting down around you in the great financial crisis. Tell me how this came about. And then what about that particular timing when everything was falling apart?
Getting into housing was something I wanted to do with Vision Fund. The concern from Vision Fund and the real financial problem in putting it together is you have this long-term asset of a loan for 20 years or whatever, but you can't get capital for more than, a loan would be 3 years for a startup. So there's this big balance sheet problem that you've got to figure out how you're going to do it. And then the second thing that I struggle with was over this period of time, my goal was how low in the market could we go with a mortgage? It's the difference between the ability to pay and the willingness to pay. Because the assumption is over 20 years or so that this family or whatever would have some real problems. I mean, COVID was one of those as I was exiting. So trying to figure out your lending methodology, looking again, taking from my NGO side, my social side, and saying, what is it about this particular family or whatever that we know when things get bad, they'll come in and work with us. Why housing? I love the product. It's such a boringly profound, beautiful product.
I suppose home ownership until you founded that company was impossible. No other banks were lending at that level, right?
No other banks were lending. I think we created the space and proved what could be done. There was nobody in this space. Even in the middle income, our first 2 or 3 loans were very middle income people by Cambodian standards. They were earning $700-800 a month. How do you get a loan to somebody who earns $300 a month? And then the global financial crisis, there was some ways in which being in Asia, you're somewhat insulated from that. It does have ripple effects. Even now in the current environment where we see humanitarian USAID closed, ODA from Western countries disappearing, a very dark narrative around philanthropy. But when you're in Asia, it's not the case.
So you're saying these people were just barely above subsistence, so the stock market crash didn't impact them?
It doesn't have anything to do with how people were living in Cambodia or even some of the markets that we tapped into. The first debt was just putting my own money, and then I was able to get $70,000 against a couple existing loans from an ANZ bank, Australia, New Zealand bank. And it's based on just a good personal relationship with the bankers that believed I could deliver on it. And then other investors came in, Insitor Fund, Michaela and Nick. They were good at working with the startup phase and bringing to me some of the financial know-how that's needed. And I think with Insitor, even today, they offer their investors, we intend to return your capital to you, but not necessarily with more. But we'll give you this long list of impact. In retrospect, I think they've always given a return. They've always done better than most people are surprised at how well you can do and have an impact. So they brought in patient capital, and then a banking group in Singapore brought in patient capital, and you just begin to crowd in people that had more money and smarter than you.
Let's back up a second. What was First Finance's theory of change? What was the core market problem you were taking on that almost everyone else was ignoring?
So this country had not had private property, period, up until beginning of late 90s. Historically, as a kingdom, all the land belonged to the king. You had the right to use. You gave a part of your crop. Then it was part of the communist socialist world. So there's no private property. The war ends. The country emerges. The government is trying to figure out land laws. People were beginning to experience the value of ownership and land ownership, and it was confusing. But part of that theory of change was it wasn't so much the house, it was the title. Because some of the poor, if all they have is 4 meters by 8 meters, they'll build their own house over time. But the process by which you then make a stake and say, I've actually got my name on a document that says that this place that I'm on is mine. There was a lot of people that I believed would work hard to pay off the loan. They have the willingness to pay despite what challenges they will have, because this was the first time they would ever own this thing. If the bank could guide them through a process that said, see this piece of paper, it's got your name on it.
So is your strategy then formalizing land tenure and helping if people had been living on the land? How did it work?
Laws began to unfold step by step. So first of all, nobody could own more than 5 hectares, but you had the right to stay on your family land. And that was largely left up to the local communes to decide who that was. And then later it was, we're going to go from right to use to actual ownership. So there was this step-by-step process, which does allow for abuse as well,
Yeah,
right?
like
all kinds of abuse. We weren't making the laws. We're obviously supportive of them. We could bring the skills and understanding of how to make sure that you landed in the right place. People were moving to other places and cities and they wanted to buy something, and the whole thing was confusing. 15 or so years later, we actually got into more traditional construction financing and things like a developer would build a property and then people would move in and start payments to the developer, and then we'd lift the lower income ones off that developer and things like that. But this was an emerging economy that was figuring out land rights, and the company could help secure those rights for you. And once you had that security, you would develop the land. You could take subsequent loans to improve the house or things like that.
And there was nobody else doing that at that segment of the market. You started First Finance. Can you walk me through a practical example of how this worked and what First Finance is doing? Maybe you could describe the process of helping a family that's been occupying land maybe for decades but lacks formal title and was vulnerable to displacement, what you guys were doing with them or for them.
At the beginning, it was mostly people calling us. I mean, I had a good reputation, and from employees to other people who were making some money and just wanted to formalize it. Somebody would come out and see you. It was a phone call. You come out and see you and take a look at the paperwork, have an interview with the family, things like that. So this difference between ability to pay, which looks at what's your income compared to how much you're going to pay, and how do you calculate your income, is normal banking. But the willingness to pay is looking for signs of aspiration and social capital. I use this term a lot, but a family that you can see both partners are in the decision together. Okay, one partner doesn't dominate, yes, we're going to do this, and the other one's hesitant. They're both working that decision process. They're taking care of their parents. They're very aspirational about their kids. You see all the trophies of won the spelling contest. So this context of this multi-income, my brother also lives here and he's got this income and we're taking care of our parents and my kid's going to be a superstar math person, was the litmus test of when future COVIDs and economic crashes or they all lose their job. This is the family that's going to really work hard to keep that land, and they're going to come in and talk to us. It was assessing that. The barriers to entry to do really good tiling was a couple $1,000s, which is way above what anybody could afford. You would then have to actually do your homework to make sure there's no other conflicting claims. So you said this is yours. Well, no, your uncle says it's his. So you have to work out those conflicting claims. And I think our first loans were like 15 years. Now they're a bit longer.
So it sounds like key to your strategy was not only doing the traditional financial risk assessment, it was also a deep non-financial incentive for the families to repay over a longer period of time as kind of a non-financial risk assessment is what I hear you saying. Is that right?
The concern, traditional microfinance is giving you a 1-year loan, 6-month loan, 2-year loan.
So you started out by doing 15-year loans?
I think it was around 15 years.
You founded this company around 2008, and then by 2013, you had made over 700 mortgages and building loans, and you only had a 2% default rate. Is that correct?
Yeah, roughly.
Do you have an idea of what the value is of the mortgages and building loans you made?
First Finance currently has a portfolio, assets under management, of about $75 million. That's where they are at this point.
And you exited it entirely from the company?
I exited entirely from the company.
So then Cut to 2016, you joined World Hope International, once again, a country director for Cambodia and the Philippines. And then by 2020, you became the chief programs officer. So walk me through this pivot, because this was back to NGO world. How did that pivot come about in your life?
I had exited Hagar and was focused on first finance and some other investments. World Hope started, the country office there, they were struggling. I had met the CEO of World Hope previously. He called me up and said, what can you do with the Cambodia office? Can you help out? Can you turn it around? Can you take a look and see what can be done? So I got back and I went and took a look and just started to build back that country program. And World Hope's board, it had a different geographical footprint. Similar to Hagar, it was open to what's the right tool. You know, is it advocacy? Is it business? Is it an NGO place? It had that energy and openness to it, which I found appealing. All the way up to the board level. You wouldn't get in trouble failing, doing the business if you did it with discipline and thoughtfulness. It had the person that hired me online had worked on a number of social ventures, and I think he was also looking for somebody with insight into how to make them work.
What was their mission in Cambodia?
It was have an impact on the poor in the community. World Hope has a trafficking component. They have a water aspect to their work. They have an emergency aspect. They have a health aspect to their work. The organization is associated with the Wesleyan Church, which has a sort of a tradition of abolitionist tradition, which reflects in some of its focus on anti-human modern day slavery today. And some of the places it's in, like Sierra Leone and Liberia, that was their particular motive. But if you're trying to solve a particular problem and an investment orientated approach is the better way to do it, that was fine.
Was it doing that when you came in where you're actually making an investment with the intent of having a return, or was it pure donor projects?
It was, I would say, like Hagar, when I came in, it was trying to do it, but maybe struggling.
When you said they were struggling, what was the problem?
There were other things going on in the organization, things that had nothing to do with programming. In Cambodia, they had this geographic area that had a high level of migration, unsafe migration, where family members were going to other countries in search for work and not the work that they thought they were going into. Then the way I would reframe that work was to say, what can we do in this community that drives the level of income? How would you bring in a good revenue model to this context? It actually turned out really quite well. We needed families to have regular cash flow that was more directly managed by the mom of the household. And so we ended up working around mushroom production and creating a market for mushroom production. Now, mushrooms turnover of one production cycle is about 30 days. The price is fairly high. You can do a mushroom house in your backyard. You don't have to walk a kilometer to the field. So there was a number of things that went into how would we choose the right enterprise for this problem.
Was this something that you were incubating then? Like you're giving people this idea, or were they already raising mushrooms?
It's called a straw mushroom from an area nearby, but we did introduce it. The NGO problem that we're trying to solve is unsafe migration. So we got to get people home, staying home. The funding came from, because of the model we chose, actually came from climate mitigation funding. Because what we were doing was we were taking the rice hull and other farm products, reusing it into mushroom production. The theory of change is to provide a consistent buying platform. So often a nonprofit will go in there and keep training people to fish. And my personal philosophy is if you invest in the platform that buys fish, grade A fish, grade B fish, that's consistent and they can see the price, they will figure out a lot of their own training. I mean, you get a few people going, but they will learn from each other. So the mushroom production was really about making sure that it's a very fast moving product and you harvest it in the evenings around between 9 and midnight. And then it's got to be at 5 a.m. in the Phnom Penh markets. So we invested in the buying platform. And people rose to the occasion of that price. If you have 100 farmers in your program, 90 of them will be what I would call food security farmer. They grow enough to take care of their family. And then about 10% really become professional farmers, in which they begin to hire staff, get multiple levels of production, really think about growing their assets. If you bring the market close enough, they begin to adapt to that market. So I could go on Google Earth and see a number of new mushroom houses that would keep popping up and sort of change that geography. It supplemented Cambodia's import of mushrooms and made a few rich farmers.
So is this only one business line that you promoted, or was this the main part of it?
Within the World Hope situation, you had a particular geography or challenge to work on. And part of it was human trafficking, which again needs lawyers and psychologists. But we had multiple business type interventions that were based depending on the problem you were trying to solve. In West Africa, one of the successful ones was Mobile Power, mofo.co. The NGO provided a place for them to work and test out their models. It's a battery swapping business in West Africa. So anywhere from your KKs, motorbikes, to cell phones, it's got internet. It's a data platform that makes sure these batteries get recycled and charged.
Are you guys actually financing this business, or are you bringing in the know-how, or are you doing both?
Both. And part of it just respects my skill set. But so NGOs will sometimes have, like in your interview with Tim, Mercy Corps, they set up a separate entity to hold their investments, right? And they bring money across and they set up a different board or structure that overlooks that. Where did World Hope play in that space was originating pre-seed, working an idea. And so funds would go from the NGO into the Delaware holding company. Delaware holding company would then make investments in the business. And then other times you would use nonprofit money to shave off the risk of the business, get it to scale.
You've used this term patient equity or patient capital a few times now. Why don't you say what you mean by that?
So patient to me is equity without, I have to exit in 5 years or 2 years. So you're putting the money in, taking a percentage of the ownership, not sure yet how long it's going to take before you should pull money out.
But it is equity, and you fully intend to have that capital return to you, and hopefully with a return.
It needs to play on the balance sheet as equity. It is equity. Or you don't want in some of this startup to have a place where you've got to exit because you're in a 5-year fund. If you've got enough patient equity and then you add additional money in there that has to have X return by year 5, you can stack it up that way.
And then around 2019, you began serving as a chairperson of TapEffect, which is a social enterprise delivering piped water systems to rural communities. Tell me how that came about, and how did that connect with your work at World Hope?
It's kind of the same story. I'm out there trying to solve social problems. And then I say, well, the only way you can solve this is with an enterprise.
Did you found it or not?
Yeah, this is the story. After I had joined World Hope, one of the things they did was with water, and they would go and drill a hole and get a hand pump kind of thing. We actually had some board members come over, and we were drilling near where we were doing mushrooms and drillers in. And this actually started in Cambodia. You will see a lot of bad infrastructure put in there, and then nobody takes care of it. So here was a community. We were adding new wells, but actually there were existing wells that were not being taken care of. And what was the difference between the working well and the non-working? One was on private property and one was on public property. The cost of a borehole in places like Cambodia might be $1,000. But what are you going to do? Drill a hole every 10 houses? Or just bad numbers. And so we were drilling, but really 10 houses away, there was already a well that was not being taken care of. So it would grow out of that frustration. In some parts of the world, the hard thing is just to find water. Once you have water, you can distribute that to a lot of different people. And you needed a revenue source. Because if you don't have revenues, who's going to maintain it and take care of it? We should not be doing this. And the hand pump issue, right? You don't need a hand pump. When the average hardware store in most parts of the world have the solar panel with a little electric pump nowadays. So it grew out of that frustration. And then at this point in my life, I had done a number of enterprises, but I needed the right entrepreneur to walk with. Somehow somebody introduced me to a man named Nick, Australian engineer, also really good with numbers. He was seeing the same problems. how can we do this better? The pushback was often, will people pay for water? Was water a public good? Is a private good? So we took on a community in northeastern Cambodia that was mountainous and really poor. And that was funded totally as a grant. If we can pull this off, if we can actually create a water system for this community, all the geological challenge, engineering challenge, and would they pay money to get a connection and pay for water? It would work in other places. And so that worked. And then again with World Hope, put in equity, and Nick had equity, and we started going after licenses. Today's systems will be 4, 5, 6,000 households. They cost about $800,000 to $1 million for the treatment system and 60, 70 kilometers of piping. And we are trying to, again, figure out what's that balance of how low we can go in the market. What's the right approach to blended capital? It works, Scott, it works. People will pay for water. And a really important driver of that payment, you obviously sell more water when you connect the bathroom, but it's the time-saving element. It's nice that it comes out of the tap clean and chlorinated. But if you have actually saved the parents 10, 20 hours of work fetching, cleaning water, that's where they see the real value in it.
Is there any unique technology to it, or is this just all about execution?
The unique thing is, can you make a system work? It's the challenge for development. It's just not a CapEx. There's a CapEx, but it's an entire system. Is the licensing correct? Does it work? Is it properly managed? Does people show up? Do you fire performers? If you look at the next appeals to you for water, and it'll tell you the product and how many people it will serve. I wish we would get money based on independent audits after year 5, after year 10. It's growing in popularity. It's called results-based funding. I would borrow the money in the meantime and compete with anyone on, is it working in 5 years? Is it working in 10 years? How many people out there? The other thing in water is everybody's trying to come up with a better water filter or treatment thing. And actually, it's the management stuff. The TapEffect is looking at ways to identify where water leaks. You think you put a pipe in the ground and normal stuff, there's a leak. And so you're producing 1 million liters and you're selling 800,000 liters. It's called non-revenue water. It's a ubiquitous problem in water systems. And there's ways to fix it are really expensive. You're going to dig up the entire street. So Nick, having twice my IQ there, they run microphones to the water and look for changes in sound. These are AI enabled. So is the pressure down, is chlorination up, and then getting that information to a centralized area where an engineer could be dispatched to solve a problem. So it's not in the coolest hand pump or a new water treatment. It's all of these enterprises. It's a system that you recycle the money, you have an investment, and you now have a customer. The customer needs to pay you or get cut off, and that customer is how you get paid.
So you had investment from a humanities shelter venture fund and from Clarion New Life Capital. I guess that was the patient capital, as you call it. Did that allow you to crowd in commercial investors as well?
The first investor was World Hope. The second investor was Shelter, which is Habitat for Humanity. They are patient. They want to see market systems improve access to. For them, it's a better housing situation when people have clean water. Clarion is family office, Singapore. They want impact, but they want return. And then right now, debt is not a problem. When we build a new system, we're able to borrow from banks and stuff to get it going. We're still raising equity. And then depending on the system, let's say the more remote or the more low income, the longer the return on capital is. You use something called viability-gap funding. So a donor might, 1/3 of these households are below a certain threshold. And instead of paying $50, I think it's 50 or 70 we charge for a connection, they will give a grant to subsidize it. So the household might pay 10. So that's a blended finance. Or you're building the system and there's a village that's of 150 people that's a kilometer away. It makes no sense to add them. Venture philanthropy or other kind of come as we'll run the pipe to that village because you're not going to recover that cost over. And so we're looking at it's project-based funding to build a system. And we want to make sure that the company can make at least 8 or 9% internal rate of return over that 7 or 8 years. But you have licenses over 20 years.
According to some figures I found, the project's currently or at some point serving 14,000 people across 19 villages.
I'm not sure the current numbers, but that's probably a year or so old.
You've got quite a lot deployed, it sounds like.
It's a big market. The more money we can crowd in, the more we can do. And we'd like to do it in other places too. Water needs an impact approach. Water is not like a tech investment that's going to give you an amazing multiple, but it makes sense, Scott. And we keep talking about sustainable development goals. We got to give people water. There's not enough philanthropic dollars out there to do it. And if we deploy in this blended way, you can draw in enough capital to solve this problem.
I've done some research and you've been vocal about challenging certain ideological positions of some of these NGOs, and you've been challenging people of what works, what doesn't work. So give me one ideology busting insight, something that most people in the development and impact investing space just seem to get fundamentally wrong.
One is that in some cases just ideologically opposed to a business approach or profit.
They don't want all that structure. What?
No. You talk about ideological position. Businesses are here to make money off us or something like that. So both sides. On the for-profit impact space, I have to keep telling people we also need charity. There are problems that are going to be solved. And then from the nonprofit, it's either we need the business world and we need this capital, because it puts the customer out front. It mobilizes far more money. It's going to drive a better solution. But if somebody in the room is fundamentally opposed to businesses involved in a utility, then you're stuck. Or, only the government is going to, this is the West Africa thing, with meds and vaccines and stuff like that. It's just this government to government relationships. But actually, most people are going to a local privately run pharmacy when they need meds, just like I go to Walmart for a vaccine. Both sides have these ideological positions. It's actually when you actually sit together and say, how do we create value together? There are people in Cambodia that are opposed that just can't wrap their mind around TapEffect, because it's a business, but the utility must be community owned. And I feel like, well, why don't you live with a community owned system? Because you won't like it. Besides, we're all drinking from bottled water at this table, which obviously came from a private company. And all of us are going to go home and have a shower now in Phnom Penh. Cambodia was very successful with the electric grid through franchising and other things. And now they're trying to create the right market for people to invest in water. Phnom Penh water supply is one of those successful businesses.
Do we need charity or pure philanthropy, or is it more that you need different types of capital that are either more patient or willing to take first loss, as opposed to a pure donation, that you have capital that's willing to accept more risk in order to crowd in more private capital? But in order to make something really work and have accountability in the long term, we still need the discipline of the market. You drink water out of the community-owned water system. You won't. That's because I suppose there's no accountability there. Whereas when you have a privately owned system and run according to impact investment principles, you're going to have accountability. You need to be sustainable. You need to give a return, but you have capital in there that allows you to crowd in more market rate capital, because there's some people providing a layer of first risk or first loss, which some people might argue that's better than pure philanthropy, where you just kind of write a check and then you lose all accountability of whatever happens to that, and you never know really what the impact is from that. What are your thoughts on that?
What you described as putting viability-gap funding to test a new idea, like we do with TapEffect, or water in many parts of health, many parts of education. We need more venture philanthropy. When you're going to build a system that has to continue to deliver on the outcome, and you have to deploy capital with that mindset of who's the customer, how does capital pay you back over periods of time. So charity is still working a lot with children with disabilities in really difficult situations, right?
I guess that's different.
So in World Hope's mindset, you would do an enterprise to try to create more of the wheelchairs or equipment or things that are needed for persons with disabilities. You would try to train more doctors and things in private clinics to service that, to actually work with that family and try to integrate those kids in the school and things like that. There's no money to be made. Or when you respond to global crises in Sudan or Gaza, you can use some direct cash transfers are brilliant, things like that. But when I think of the things we want to achieve in distributions of meds or vaccinations or things like that, and we're not bringing, you use the term accountability. What falls apart in the NGO model is that accountability that comes from capital being deployed. And money isn't just bad thing. Money is a way to measure an accountability. How much water are these people buying? Is your model based on a good revenue forecast? If they don't pay, will you cut the water off? That world still has to exist. Charity might have to come from a neighbor who shares their water. I know one of your questions is going to be, what would you change or do? And I said, you just need a lot more of this, whether it's venture philanthropy, patient capital, but as I've done with the mushroom business and Terra and First Finance, is taking on these big global problems and saying, how do we do this from an impact perspective?
There's a lot more impact money flowing into climate type of investing, but social investing suffers because climate related investing has matured more and is more readily accepted, whereas social justice investing is more difficult, and a lot of investors shy away from that. I had Nick Donahoe from BII, was at BII until last year, and they're investing all over Africa. The return that they look for is quite low, I think 2% or something like that. But it's not charity. They have the ability to write things off and have done so, but they're very much accountable for where they're investing and what the impact was and what the financial returns were. And I think overall, during his tenure, they've beat the returns by quite a lot. Tell me about your two wallets.
The two wallets is this, we mentioned it early on, this disconnect between our philanthropic giving and our investing. When we put money into our retirement savings or something like that, we should get a return. And then when it comes to this philanthropic side, we give to a story and we're not asking the kind of hard questions that we need to. I see it in things where you meet a person who's, say, they really were successful in some aspect of their life as a engineer or whatever else, and they make money and they want to give it away. And what I'd like to do is say, let's do better engineering projects and somewhere else. Let's bring the skills and experience and your business acumen. And they would be, no, actually, I want to do a school feeding program. The motivations for the two are quite different. And if we brought more values and hard questions to the impact onto the investment side of our world, we'd probably steer more of our money to impact investing. And if we brought more financial discipline to the giving side of our world, we'd be asking different questions of NGOs. With TapEffect, it's a good example where there are places where we would like grants to come in, say to subsidize connections for the poor. And it might be very hard for a person to give. They will give to and pump wells somewhere. But to connect households to an actual working system is just no. We would normally get that money from more venture philanthropy institutions that understand what they're buying with their money.
I also want to know why most chickens never walk across the road.
Question is, why don't some chickens cross the road? To me, it's about studying what's actually working. So when I was looking at them drilling a well and saying, why do we keep drilling wells? And then looking around to see what wells still work. what are they doing with those wells? An early study that when I was with Hagar, we did a study on helping women to start their own business. Who's going to argue with that? Many of them were failing. And so you do an assessment and you ask all those who are failing, what's not working? And they would say, well, I ran out of capital. The ones that are succeeding, what's the difference with them? And it wasn't because they did or didn't go to a financial literacy training program. There were aspects of, again, social capital. If the baby was sick, the sister could step into the shop and those sorts of things. There were aspects of personal agency. And it is this search for not which chicken gets out in the road and gets run over, but why the ones that aren't crossing the road. In my World Vision capacity, I got to the point where I would refuse to go to any cut ribbons sort of thing. Start something off or something, and I would heading off to West Africa or something and say, show me something that's 5 years old and 10 years old and still working. I want to go there and celebrate the anniversary of what works. Drive along the road and see what's working, what's selling, what's moving. Why are people doing it? Build on that. That's the chicken cross the road. What's actually working? How can you grow it? Have big arguments about what works. Scott, one thing to watch is outcome-based funding, this new trend. The hard work is deciding what success looks like. And it's going to be different for different people. But if this group gets together and said, this is what success looks like, how do we put fuel on it and then invest in it and get paid for that outcome? Fuel what works. Take care of the chickens that aren't crossing the road.
You've mentioned repeatedly while we've been talking about being accountable or measuring, and you just mentioned what does impact look like? What are the metrics in your experience that matter the most when you're trying to prove that a social venture is viable and worth investing in, and which metrics matter the most to attract what you call higher quality capital?
One is your cash flow. So some of the stuff is basics to any, about how you manage your cash flow, when are you going to make a return. And then it just depends on what kind of social impact that you're looking for. And in Hagar's case, how many people can you employ from this unemployable category and how fast can you graduate them? The point is to sit there and have that agreement. Okay, we're investing in this water business. Are you okay with an 8% return? If we do better than that, would we take the money out, or would we pay a higher return or not? Or are you okay with no return but higher impact? I think all of us would like to have some magic quantifiable number that consistently be used. But I think once you get to social aspects, they are very contextualized. So it's just being very clear up front to say at what, like with TapEffect, at what cost can we add more people to a clean water pipe water system?
In your career, you've touched nearly every essential sector, like inclusive finance, renewables, water, affordable housing, ag value chains. What patterns leap out at you about what actually drives success or failure when you're investing in social ventures? Are there any patterns that you've observed?
The right management team, leader, good system.
That's like basic VC.
Yeah.
It's the management team.
Who are you? What's the management team? How well are they? What kind of data do you have on what's working or not? I like these very boring products. There's just water that comes clean and fresh 24 hours out of a pipe is glorious.
Well, that's basic infrastructure, We've talked about your journey from humanitarian aid, entrepreneurship to impact. How's your philosophy on purpose and stewardship and responsibility shifted over the years as you've moved between these different worlds?
It's still purpose first. And that's just a DNA issue. And that has nothing to do with a value judgment about somebody that would be different. So it's just my DNA. I go out there and look at these basic issues of good health care and how do we get better systems to solve it. Look for what works, pour fuel on it.
I guess it's working when you've crossed in these different worlds, humanitarian aid, which is different than entrepreneurship, which is different than impact investing. Has your philosophy on purpose and stewardship shifted over the years? Because you started out in humanitarian aid and then you cycled through and you went back eventually to humanitarian aid, but you're also still involved in impact and entrepreneurship.
I think over time, like discovering the value of social ventures and my skills as a leader, I've definitely grown. I think we're different today. In order to tackle these things, how is my philosophy different? I'm much better at knowing that we need all of it working together to create real value. I didn't leave school with an understanding of good social ventures. I've learned that over time. I've learned to work with governments over time. Part of solving the water problem is government policy that allows these private operators to work. I'm agnostic about any sort of dualism or it's something like, here's the problem. What's going to work in this context?
It's what works
And
what's not going to
work. The impact stuff is because it forces you to build a system in which you're accountable. The measurement is money, but it's a long-term accountable system. You can't get out of a political system and you can't get out of a nonprofit system. They solve different problems.
I've got a few rapid fire questions for you before we wrap up. Don't overthink these. Just give me whatever comes to mind. Or if nothing does, then feel free to take a pass. That's okay too. If you had to name the single most important challenge in the impact investing space at this particular time, what would it be?
More impact investment. Just we need to crowd more money in all types of patient capital, venture philanthropy that shaves off the risk to good returns for good impact. Just more.
What do you know now about building investable social infrastructure enterprises that you wish you knew when you first began working on essential services in Cambodia?
I didn't know what was the whole social venture impact investing side. It was not part of my education or things like that. I've had to learn it this long, slow way.
So this would have been a thing, if you'd known about, you would have saved yourself some grief.
If I had launched my career with a better understanding of the value of social ventures to drive accountability and build better systems, then I wouldn't have had to figure it out.
When you launched your career, this wasn't a thing. If you would have talked to someone about social venture capital or impact venture capital, they'd look at you like you had two green heads.
Maybe it did exist. I mean, I can still see it in my father's work, trying to figure out how you manage or run things better. Trappist monks making beer to generate some money. So that was like 400 or 500 years ago. It certainly was a part of my education.
It still was something that you wish you would have known.
I probably would have taken more business classes rather than just economics classes.
You don't have to name names, but can you describe an investment that you invested in that checked all of your impact boxes, but in the end, it just didn't work out? And what were the investing lessons learned from that experience?
Shortly after first finance, I did a property development, a low-income construction called Urban Village, and it didn't work. It was sort of mixed income. It was 40 units. There was too much rent-seeking behavior around the infrastructure. And if I had done it with a Cambodian partner that could navigate some of that kind of stuff, it sold very well. But a project that could take 9 to 12 months took me 2.5 years. And money doesn't want to wait on that.
What was the lesson learned? The lesson learned that you needed a local partner, or what?
I underestimated the role of rent-seeking behavior when it comes to roads and infrastructure and that kind of stuff. That then took too long to get the projects completed. If I had a partner that could navigate that stuff so that you could turn around a project every 12 months, it would have been fine.
Now give me the opposite. Describe an investment that you were initially skeptical about, or maybe you passed on it because in the end you thought, no, this will never work. And it ended up actually performing way better than you could have imagined, had way more impact than you imagined. And what was the investing lesson learned from that experience that you were skeptical or passed on something that turned out brilliantly?
I got two good answers here. One was the mushroom business. Agriculture is a tough place to get a margin for farmers, right? And we spend a lot of time training people and things like that. The theory of change, or what pivoted for me, was this belief that they would respond to the right price and the right platform. So if somebody was there buying every evening at a consistent price, they would rise to the occasion. And that just worked so much better than I thought it would.
Why were you skeptical of that?
Because the improving agriculture is just notoriously difficult in this poor context. And so much money is spent on improving training or inputs. So somehow if they could learn more or they had better fertilizer or better this or that, they would get. And so a lot of money goes into that input side, but still the price of a product sucks. The other thing is people invest a lot in studying the value chain and all this sort of thing. In this case, it was, we would just create the platform, which mushrooms will be purchased at this time, at this prices. When you plant a mushroom, you know the price at the other end. And they adapted, they brought in, I mean, there was some training and things like that, but they were constantly innovating and adapting because they had the market at the other side. And they just rose to the occasion of that price. If I was doing agriculture projects again, as I said, I need to solve incomes for this rural communities. I would focus on the platform that pulls the product. Once you solve that, people will innovate.
You pushed money across the table, but you thought this won't work, and it did work.
I was skeptical it would work. Right. And it worked so much better than I thought it would do in terms of rising incomes of this particular community. The other one was inside talking about conservation projects. In Northeast Cambodia, the World Conservation Society has a Khao Sima Wildlife Sanctuary. It's a carbon-funded project. They were doing the science and some of the working with the government. And I was asked to take a look at this particular ethnic group, Banong, indigenous group there, and how do they benefit from this conservation. And this is this Jiahu Gibbon Camp or Jiahu Research Center. The theory of change was to the extent the indigenous community that had strong conservation valued the forest, to the extent that they could own and manage their own assets, they would protect it. And so through WCS and others, they were able to give this group an indigenous land title, which gave them some control. And then we brought in these economic activities that were based on conservation, the Jiahu Gibbon Camp. I just think in future generations, what's left of that forest will be because this particular people group are really empowered and have an economic interest in maintaining it, more so than what's actually officially protected. That has created really good employment, and it's, Cambodia's number one wildlife experience at this point, and it's a platform for a number of universities to do research on climate and things like that. At one point when I was considering the project, I remember a particular leader in the NGO said, this is just going to be, at the best, you get a backpackers in there. And it's so much better than that is today. When people own that conservation agenda, particularly those that highly value the environment for what it is, and they can earn off of it, it's very powerful.
And lastly, if someone wants to get into the impact investment space, where would you advise them to start?
Go to a place where you want to have an impact. Where do you want to be? And if you can get to that place and get around people that are making that happen, I think that's the starting, which is different than the MBA and then McKinsey or something like that. But in my kind of space, it's get to the place that you can make value and attach yourself to people who can open doors for you.
Talmage, this has really been a masterclass from your stories growing up in Nigeria to humanitarian work in Cambodia to your blended finance model being deployed across multiple ventures, and more recently the work you're doing with TapEffect to bring safe water to rural communities, and all this happening in some of the most challenging environments on earth. You've shared a lot of hard-won insights with me today, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I've learned a lot from it. So before we wrap up, tell everyone where they can find out about what you're up to.
I have other ventures that I'm involved with, and I'm working with the CEO Institute, which I mentioned earlier. It's a business association in Cambodia.
What's the best way for people to find out what you're up to?
Find me on LinkedIn. That's the best way. Send me a message on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with people that are interested in how they can better deploy their capital or be a better entrepreneur.
And for the listening audience, Talmage is spelled Talmage, and last name is Payne, spelled Payne. And you can find him on LinkedIn. So, Talmage, thanks so much for this.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate the opportunity to unpack some of this stuff myself.
Thanks again. Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.